1776, a night when the London fog lay wet and cold over the stone fortresses of Admiralty Yard. It was to be a fateful night in the life of Captain James Cook, 47 years old and a bona fide household name after his first 2 voyages of discovery. Cook had spent more than 6 years at sea, venturing to many corners of the globe. Now he was retired, with a prestigious and lucrative post at the Greenwich Naval Hospital to pay the bills, and a hero's laurels to rest on indefinitely. But the letters of the great explorer reveal a soul already restless without a ship to command.
Whether I can bring myself to like ease and retirement, time will show. The Resolution will soon be sent out again, but I shall not command her. My fate drives me from one extreme to another.
The Admiralty brass had a devious plan in mind for the famed navigator when they invited him to dinner on that blustery winter night. After plenty of robust wine and rich flattery, Cook's first and most loyal supporter, Sir Hugh Palliser, and his newest patron, the Earl of Sandwich, asked the celebrated captain to advise them about an upcoming naval expedition. The search for the legendary Northwest Passage between Europe and Asia.
From the 16th century, European nations sought for either a northwest or a northeast passage above North America or above Europe and Asia. A northwest passage would have greatly cut the sailing time between Europe and China.
Not accidentally, Palliser and Sandwich mentioned to the upwardly mobile Cook the £20,000 reward for the man who actually unravelled this last great geographical mystery. It was a princely sum, enough to make Cook a wealthy man indeed. The promise of riches, combined with the appeal to Cook's vanity and continual yearning for adventure, were too much for the retired hero to resist.
The result is that Cook is enticed into it, partly perhaps by the chance of upward mobility into the lower aristocracy with all this reward, partly, I think, a sense of possibility to be the discoverer of the Northwest Passage.
And thus the die was cast. Cook raised his glass and agreed to lead one last voyage. He couldn't have imagined the dangers into which that simple toast would lead him. To find himself in the company of the most important men in England proved just how far the famous explorer had risen from his very humble roots. Yet mastery of the sea had seemed to be an indelible part of James Cook's destiny, despite his unassuming boyhood in a tiny Yorkshire village. The son of a humble day labourer, young Cook displayed an early aptitude in mathematics and in language, though he never did perfect his spelling. By his late teens, the ambitious young man was chafing to see the world that lay beyond the boundaries of the windswept Yorkshire moors.
He wanted adventure and he wanted to get away from the kind of labourer's work that his father had.
At the age of 18, the hardy, 6-foot-tall lad became an apprentice with the Walkers of Whitby shipping firm. Within 5 years, after many a late-night squinting over tedious charts and trigonomic calculations, Cook had taught himself the basics of navigation. His perseverance paid off, and Cook was promoted to mate. He made himself invaluable to his employer, who clearly had plans for his advancement. But young James had other, more ambitious ideas. In 1755, with the looming possibility of the 7 Years' War with France, he joined the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman. It was an enormous risk, for to become a naval officer in those days depended less on seamanship than on patronage connections. But aboard the 6-gun, 400-man Eagle, Seaman Cook would meet a commanding officer who looked for merit rather than breeding in his men, the powerful, well-connected Sir Hugh Palliser. Palliser took Cook under his wing and became his strong supporter.
The British Navy ran totally on patronage, and to have a patron and rising patron was what you wanted. If Palliser was going up, Cook believed if he supported Palliser, he would go up too, and Palliser did become comptroller of the Navy.
In the summer of 1757, just 2 years after joining the Navy, Cook was made master of the Pembroke and sent to North America. His mapping and navigational brilliance helped ensure a British victory in the Battle of Quebec. But when the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, the market for naval heroes began to wane. For the first time in his already remarkable young life, the 34-year-old Cook seemed to be facing a dead end in his career. But both heaven and earth, it seemed, were conspiring to move James Cook a step closer to his formidable destiny. For the leaders of Europe, the Age of Enlightenment heralded the birth of a new era of scientific curiosity and exploration. Astronomers had predicted that the planet Venus would pass between the Earth and the Sun in June of 1769. An accurate observation would make possible the first calculation of the distance between the Earth and the Sun, a breakthrough in celestial navigation and in man's understanding of his place in the undiscovered oceans of the universe. In 1768, the British Royal Society decided to send one of Her Majesty's ships to the South Pacific, deemed a key location to observe this remarkable event. But the Royal Society had a second secret purpose for a Venus expedition, the search for a possible new continent to claim for the king, the mythical Terra Australis.
Terra Australis was the name given to the supposed southern continent. It was a product of theoretical geography. It developed out of a sense that the landmass in the northern hemisphere had to be balanced by an equivalent landmass in the southern hemisphere, or else the world would be out of kilter.
Alexander Dalrymple, a Scottish gadfly and self-proclaimed adventurer who passionately believed in Terra Australis, campaigned vigorously to the Royal Society to lead the expedition himself. But the Navy wouldn't approve a civilian to command one of its ships. Instead, they chose James Cook, an unknown, common-born navigator. Dalrymple was furious, and from that point on appointed himself Cook's lifelong nemesis. Despite antagonism from Dalrymple, Cook began preparations for his first voyage of discovery. The detail-oriented mariner supervised every step himself in the preparations of his ship, the HMS Endeavour, from the caulking of the hulls to the fitting of her masts and sails. By August of 1768, the Endeavour was bound for Tahiti, thousands of miles away. In addition to the 85 crewmen aboard, several upper-class gentlemen lined the ship's decks. It was common during this era of exploration for wealthy, educated young men to buy their way onto voyages like the Venus expedition. On this trip, young Joseph Banks, an amateur botanist from an influential family, had brought with him an entourage of compatriots, two of them artists, whose goal was to document every detail of this historic trip. The self-educated Cook was inspired by the presence of these active young minds, and he and Banks became fast friends.
Banks paid for himself and for a party of scientists and artists to go on the Endeavour voyage, and returned with the greatest collection of natural history ever brought into one country at one time.
As the ship made its way to Tahiti, stopping to provision at exotic ports and engaging in trade with curious islanders, Banks and his artists put down on paper the strange and wondrous things they saw, including documenting the impressive leadership abilities of James Cook himself. For their captain was a humanist in an inhumane age, ahead of his time in many ways. Cook brought some radical changes to shipboard life that would have far-reaching consequences.
Cook had a very lively interest in maintaining the health of his crews. He had to do that because the voyages were so long. If the crews became unhealthy, he couldn't succeed with the voyages.
The deadly disease of scurvy was the bane of long sea voyages. Ships would set out with extra crew in preparation for the certainty that many of the men would not survive. After research and reading, Cook became convinced that scurvy could be overcome with a diet that included healthy amounts of sauerkraut, not a crew favorite.
The sauerkraut the men at first would not eat until I put in practice a method I never once knew to fail with seamen, and this was to have some of it dressed every day for the captain's table, and permitted all the officers, without exception, to make use of it, and left it to the option of the men either to take as much as they pleased, or none at all. The moment they see their superior set a value upon it, it becomes the finest stuff in the world, and the inventor an honest fellow.
With his gift for sly persuasion and his ability to lead by example, Cook managed to convince his men to accept their daily ration of sauerkraut. Physicians would shortly prove Cook wrong in embracing his sauerkraut solution to scurvy. What really kept Cook's men as healthy as any crew in the history of seafaring was his habit of calling into port at regular intervals to stockpile stores with fresh fruits and vegetables. Cook also took pains to keep his men on shorter watches and openly encouraged physical exercise on land and on board ship.
The sense of Cook is as someone who really wanted to do well by his men. He was from the working class, upwardly mobile, and he wanted to, in a sense, care for his crew.
Land ho! Land ho!
The Endeavour arrived in Tahiti on April the 13th, 1769, after nearly 8 months at sea. Ever industrious and orderly, the British sailors and scientists set up tents, workshops, and the makeshift observatory where they would watch the passage of Venus. But they were also observing the anomalies of this new and exotic culture. At the same time, the curious Tahitians were studying the strange, pale Englishmen. Mindful of the importance of diplomacy, Cook instructed his men to treat the islanders with every imaginable humanity. This was sometimes not a simple matter due to frequent culture clashes. To the Polynesians, freely taking something that belonged to someone else was not considered a crime, while to the English, the islanders were devious thieves. Cook set a new example of dealing with this troubling conflict with an even-handed absence of violence that earned him a peacemaker's reputation.
I think Cook had, for his time, very enlightened attitudes towards the indigenous peoples he met. He showed an extraordinary ability to go beyond the strictures of his culture and to place himself within the mores and the rituals of another culture.
On June the 3rd, the men of the Endeavour gathered on deck, on the beaches and in the observatory to watch the passage of Venus across the face of the sun.
The air was perfectly clear, so that we had every advantage we could desire in observing the whole of the passage of the planet Venus over the sun's disk.
Now the first portion of Cook's assignment, the observation of Venus, was complete. After a tearful send-off from the Tahitians, among whom Cook had become exceedingly popular, he set sail again in search of Dalrymple's elusive Terra Australis. The men of the Endeavour would spend 8 frustrating months riding the swells of the high seas, passing and charting the mystical Society Islands and the craggy, inhospitable coast of New Zealand. But the southern continent remained an intangible fantasy.
I have made no very great discoveries, yet I have explored more of the great South Sea than all that have gone before me. So much that little remains now to be done to have a thorough knowledge of that part of the globe.
Finally sailing home in May of 1770, the Endeavour crawled along Australia's Great Barrier Reef, 1,250 miles of treacherous coral that can instantly sink a ship. Despite Cook's efforts, the Endeavour became embedded on a razor-sharp reef. But the winds of fate were favourable that day, as they would be for Cook for years to come. The Endeavour was saved from disaster by a piece of coral stuck in her hull. The close call with Providence was a watershed event in Cook's life at sea.
Cook wrote afterwards that a reef like this is scarcely known in Europe. It is a wall of coral rock rising perpendicular from the unfathomable deep. And it was at that moment that he began to understand just the risks of being an explorer. And so he began to realize a destiny that I don't think he had been conscious of earlier.
The Endeavour and crew finally arrived home in July of 1771, 3 years after embarking. Cook hadn't found the mythical southern continent, but his fame had already begun to spread, and he returned home to an England longing for new heroes. Cook, a working-class boy made good, was tailor-made for idolatry, and he soon found himself besieged by admirers. But Cook's arch-rival, Alexander Dalrymple, was determined to drag the Yorkshire boy down. The jealous Dalrymple insisted that Terra Australis was out there, probably somewhere Cook had failed to go.
What was so interesting about the first voyage was not as much what it did, but the potential questions that it raised. It was a tantalizer, a creator of doubt. Was there a southern continent, or was there not?
Angered by Dalrymple's assault on his reputation, Cook was eager to redeem himself and put the contentious matter to rest. He proposed another expedition, one he himself would have a hand in planning.
To put an end to all diversity of opinion about a matter so curious and important.
At the end of the first voyage, he had developed a plan for proving finally whether there was land or not in the southern hemisphere. He would cross parts of the Southern Ocean where no European had been before.
The Admiralty embraced the expedition, buying 2 new ships to replace Cook's battered Endeavour, christening them the Resolution and Adventure.
The reason for travelling with 2 ships was that if one would be wrecked, then there would be another one to take survivors back home. This was the point made very clearly by the almost wrecking of the Endeavour on the Barrier Reef.
Cook set out on his second voyage, determined to enter higher latitudes than any man had ever explored, in search once again of the lost continent of Terra Australis. He looked forward to the adventure with a steadying blend of faith, confidence, and euphoria.
When I think of the inhospitable parts I'm going to, I think the voyage dangerous. I, however, enter upon it with great cheerfulness. Providence has been very kind to me on many occasions, and I trust in the continuation of the divine protection.
By January of 1773, Cook was deep in the southern latitudes, just as he had so meticulously planned. But instead of reaching the fabled Terra Australis, he encountered a wall of ice and became the first man to cross the Antarctic Circle. The eerie silence descended over the ships like a curtain.
First and middle parts, strong gales attended with a thick fog, sleet and snow, all the rigging covered with ice and the air excessive cold.
As the month wore on, Cook stood shivering on the decks of the Resolution as a frigid veil of fog crept menacingly towards the 2 ships. When the fog lifted, there was no sign of the Adventure. Cook ordered the signal guns fired. But the sister ship was nowhere to be seen. Cook had prepared for a possible separation by ordering an emergency rendezvous at Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand. The Resolution made sail in that direction, plotting islands and seeking evidence of the lost continent at every point along the way. By the time the 2 ships reunited in May of 1773, Cook had already sailed thousands of miles and 117 days without sight of the mythical Terra Australis. He was still convinced there was no southern continent, but this time Dalrymple and other doubters would have no grounds for questioning his thoroughness. His adventurous spirit drove him onward towards new waters of the South Pacific he hadn't explored on his previous voyage.
I must own I have little expectation of making any valuable discovery. Nevertheless, it must be allowed that the sciences will receive some improvement therefrom, especially navigation and geography. My intention is now to go in search of Easter Island, the situation of which is so variously laid down that I have little hopes of finding.
Cook had underestimated his own navigational genius. On March the 11th, 1774, he sighted the looming stone monoliths of Easter Island. He briefly refreshed the boats, but the brooding presence of the statuary seemed to portend danger.
and got on board a few casks of water and traded with the natives for some of the produce of the island, which appeared in no great plenty, and the water so bad as not to be worth carrying on board. And the ship not in safety determined me to shorten my stay here.
On April the 7th, inhabitants of the Marquesa Islands looked to the horizon with a combination of excitement and fear. There, just off the coast, were two enormous vessels steered by white-skinned strangers, wearing heavy, uncomfortable-looking garments. The Resolution and the Adventure had become the first European ships to reach this distant land in over 200 years.
The inhabitants of these isles are without exception as fine a race of people as any in this sea, or perhaps any whatever. The men are tattooed or curiously marked from head to foot, which makes them look dark, but the women, who are but little tattooed, youths and young children, are as fair as some Europeans.
Sailing back to New Zealand, Cook made the last discovery of the epic second voyage, a large and mountainous island which he named New Caledonia. Cook spent only 10 days here, but it was long enough to undergo another transforming experience that further bolstered his growing sense of destiny.
He ate a fish which people told him was very likely to be poisonous, and he was desperately ill for some days and only saved because one of the ship's dogs was sacrificed to make broth for him. But when he recovered, he wanted to go and eat the fish again. It seems to me that this is a sign of his not accepting that there are any impediments to what he can do.
By February of 1775, after circumnavigating over half the globe, Cook and his weary men set sail for England by way of Cape Horn.
I have now done with the southern Pacific Ocean. I will not say it was impossible to get farther to the south, but the attempting of it would have been a dangerous and rash enterprise, and what I believe no man in my situation would have thought of.
After 3 years and thousands of miles at sea, Cook had finally proven that the southern continent of Terra Australis was nothing but a myth. His place in history would have been assured even if he'd never sailed again.
What is critical about the second voyage is that it creates an ideal of what a perfect voyage should be. He was able to be precise, a great navigator, a great leader of men.
Now the most celebrated explorer of his time, Cook should have been content to bask in the glory of his historic accomplishments and accept the accolades being laid adoringly at his feet. And yet his most daring and dangerous journey still lay ahead. In honor of the near perfection of his second voyage round the world, Captain James Cook was rewarded with a position at Greenwich Hospital that meant a lifetime of security for his wife and children. For the humble son of a day labourer, the praise and notoriety must have been satisfying, accompanied by a growing sense of destiny, of having taken his place alongside the greatest explorers of history. But Cook seemed ambivalent about his semi-retirement.
My fate drives me from one extreme to another. A few months ago, the whole southern hemisphere was hardly big enough for me, and now I'm going to be confined within the limits of Greenwich Hospital, which are far too small for an active mind like mine. I must confess, however, it is a fine retreat and a pretty income.
Then, the British Admiralty, long curious about the existence of a northwest passage between the Atlantic and Pacific, convinced Cook to end his short retirement and undertake a third epic voyage. But unlike his previous adventures, from the start this journey was plagued by harbingers of calamity. Cook was too busy finishing the written account of his last voyage to oversee the preparation of his ships, and in the corrupt naval shipyards, slow and shoddy workmanship delayed the departure date. Even Cook himself seemed uneasy. In his private letters to friends, the usually fearless explorer revealed an uncharacteristic tone of doubt and foreboding.
It is certain I have quitted an easy retirement for an active and perhaps dangerous voyage. This attempt to force the Northwest Passage must be hazardous, and it must be made with great caution. If I am fortunate enough to get safe home, there's no doubt, but it will be greatly to my advantage.
The United States was only 8 days old when Cook and the Resolution finally set out from Plymouth on July the 12th, 1776. Cook seemed tired, distracted already, annoyed by the animals on board at the request of King George.
The ship is a Noah's Ark, lacking only a few females of her own species.
They left without their companion ship, the Discovery, which lay dockside, awaiting Captain Charles Clark, made late by family difficulties. 4 months later, the crew of the Resolution greeted the tardy Discovery into Cape Town with a hearty welcome. At last the voyage could begin in earnest. Captain Cook looked to the unexplored horizon with renewed confidence and ambition. After all, the greatness of Cook's latest adventure seemed as certain as all his others. He was surrounded by an able crew, several of them veterans of his earlier voyages. Many of the sailors idolized Cook. Among them was the gregarious first mate David Samwell, whose journals reveal his reverence for the great captain.
He was beloved by his people, who looked up to him as a father and obeyed his commands with alacrity. The confidence we placed in him was unremitting, our admiration for his great talents unbounded.
Leaving Cape Town, the 112 hand-picked men of Cook's crew felt safe and protected under the command of the master they so admired. Some had witnessed Cook perform feats of seamanship that defied logic, and down in the hammocks and mess halls they whispered amongst themselves of his uncanny ability to sense wind patterns others couldn't fathom, or to glimpse things in the water's ghostly darkness beyond the vision of other men.
Cook would come out on the deck in his nightshirt and he would say, change course because there's a reef ahead. Nobody could see. In the great expanses of the Pacific, to have somebody who says change course because there's a reef ahead, and then in the morning they would see the reef, this Cook seemed almost superhuman.
But precious little sailing passed before the first crack in Cook's armour appeared. On the hot night of August the 10th, 1777, the ship's surgeon came on deck and saw to his horror that the Resolution was within leagues of being crushed by breakers just off the Cape Verde Islands.
Hard to starboard! Hard to starboard! Brace the yards! Sharp up!
The Resolution narrowly escaped destruction in the heavy waves, but the surgeon and many of the crew were stunned by Cook's lapse in navigation.
To bring a ship into so alarming a situation as we were in at this time, without being able to give a satisfactory reason for it, certainly deserves the severest reprehension.
The sloppiness that caused such a shocking near miss was indeed out of character for the perfectionist Cook. Already the fates seemed to be conspiring secretly against the great captain, and his own hubris had perhaps made Providence his enemy in his search for the elusive Northwest Passage. By the summer of 1777, Cook and his companion ship had meandered through the vast expanse of the dreamy blue South Pacific. But faced with mischievous and thieving Polynesian islanders, on this journey Cook responded with uncharacteristic violence. Midshipman George Gilbert noted Cook's savagery in his journals.
Captain Cook punished in a manner rather unbecoming, by cutting off their ears, firing at them with a small shot. I can't well account for Captain Cook's proceedings on this occasion, as they were so very different from his conduct in like cases in his former voyages.
They were dangerously behind in schedule, and risked missing the narrow window of weather that would allow them to tackle the Bering Straits, the imagined entrance to the Northwest Passage. But as Cook's weary eyes scanned the horizon, fate presented him with his final and most famous discovery:
Land ho!
the lush and beautiful Hawaiian Islands. But even amidst this unexpected triumph, the great captain's temperament seemed to have turned darker, angrier. He was more irritable, brooding, and violent than anyone on board had ever seen him.
his behaviour had changed markedly. The junior officers developed a habit of saying, "I had a heaver from the old boy." Heaver meaning the frenzied Tahitian dance. So he evidently would stamp his feet and throw himself into paroxysms of rage. And so the change in the man was evident to all who were about him.
Now, in addition to the rigours of capricious seas and the everyday hardships of shipboard life, Cook's officers and sailors had a new foe to contend with, a brilliant but unstable captain. And as Cook's ship sighted the Polynesian paradise of Hawaii, new dangers of a magnitude previously unimagined awaited the legendary explorer. By early September of 1778, Captain James Cook found himself thwarted in his quest for the Northwest Passage. Massive ice floes off Alaska blocked his entrance to the upper latitudes. After months of searching, his ships had run so short of provisions that Cook and his men had to eat walrus. In one of the rare occasions of his triumphant career, the legendary adventurer was facing almost certain failure.
He was seemingly tired, he was probably ill, and circumstances began to get beyond him.
Disheartened and close to exhaustion, Cook finally changed his plans. He set a southerly course, preparing to winter in the newly discovered Hawaiian Islands. With his ships repaired and men refreshed, he would try again for the passage in the spring. But as his ships neared Hawaii's Kealakekua Bay, Cook's downcast spirits had occasion to rejoice. The arrival of the Resolution and Discovery prompted a greeting that would have lifted the heart of any weary sailor. Thousands of exuberant islanders in canoes paddled out to meet the English explorers, raising their voices in a joyous welcome song.
It is a wondrous welcome. Perhaps the greatest welcome that any British explorer or any European explorer has ever had. There are so many people on the Discovery clinging to the boat that they're afraid the boat's going to capsize. This is something totally new to them, baffling, exciting.
The Hawaiians' thunderous welcome worked an immediate magic on shipboard morale. Midshipman Gilbert wrote rapturously of the arrival in his journal.
The joy that we experienced on our arrival here is only to be conceived by people under like circumstances. For after suffering excessive hunger and a number of other hardships, we had now come into a delightful climate where we had almost everything we could wish for.
But there was more than Hawaiian hospitality behind their buoyant welcome. Cook had fortuitously anchored in Kealakekua Bay during a religious festival. Suddenly, the famous explorer was more than just a great man. To some Hawaiians, he was perhaps a holy man.
When Cook arrived at Hawaii, he came at the time of the Makahiki, the harvest festival. At this time, Lono, the god of produce and peace, was in the ascendancy. Because the Hawaiian cosmology told them that Lono would arrive in a canoe and make a clockwise progress through the islands, and because Cook happened to come into Kealakekua Bay where the chief temple of Lono was, the Hawaiians considered that he was the incarnation of Lono and that he was arriving at the proper time.
Not all of the islanders were convinced of Cook's status as an actual deity, but there were enough coincidences between the circumstances of the English arrival and ancient Hawaiian law to sway many influential island priests.
He came in during the middle of the celebration, a ritual made real by an actual human being.
The islanders treated Cook with reverence, showering him with food, precious gifts, and honoring him with sacred ceremonies. For a man already consumed with a sense of his own destiny, such veneration must have been a heady experience indeed. Despite the flattery, Cook's ill temper didn't improve. After enjoying 3 weeks of the Hawaiians' boundless generosity, the Englishmen began to sense an impatience in their hosts. Wary of overstaying his welcome and suspecting that the Hawaiians had depleted their own food sources to impress their visitors, Cook ordered his men to prepare for departure. Laden with farewell gifts, the English explorers left Kealakekua Bay on February the 4th, 1779.
They leave thinking this was the best island they had ever visited. It doesn't get better than this.
But just 3 days out, the ships encountered a tempest. Then the unthinkable. The Resolution's foremast, the work of shoddy naval shipwrights, snapped during a violent squall. Cook had no choice. He had to reroute his ships back to the safety of Kealakekua Bay. The injured vessels limped into the cove that had so recently been the site of their triumphant welcome. This time, there was no grand reception. The somber return was chronicled by Lieutenant William King aboard Cook's vessel.
Upon our coming to anchor, we were surprised to find our reception very different from what it had been on our first arrival. No shouts, no bustle, no confusion, but a solitary bay, with only here and there a canoe stealing close along the shore.
Midshipman George Gilbert darkly noted the changed attitude of the islanders towards the returning Englishmen.
The natives did not appear to receive us this time with that friendship that they had done before. Our quick return seemed to create a kind of jealousy amongst them with respect to our intentions.
During the Englishman's absence, the celebration to Lono had ended, and a new god had gained the ascendancy. Ku, the god of war and human sacrifice. Cook's untimely return had upset the sacred Hawaiian cosmology, and the islanders were swift to show their displeasure. They armed themselves with stones, ready to attack. They refused to aid the crewmen repairing the foremast, and the normal Polynesian thieving, which the diplomatic Cook had handled so well in the past, swelled out of control. The hostility between the Hawaiians and their unwelcome guests grew with each passing hour. Early on the morning of February the 14th, 1779, Cook learned that the Discovery's cutter had been stolen by natives during the night. For a furious Cook, this brazen theft was the last straw. He was determined to retrieve the cutter no matter what the cost. Cook angrily barked out his orders to his men. He sent several boats into the bay to intercept all native canoes.
In going on board, the captain expressed his sorrow that the behavior of the Indians would at last oblige him to use force, for that they must not, he said, imagine they have gained an advantage over us.
Cook was going ashore with 10 Marines and other crew to take the High Chief Kalaniʻōpuʻu hostage until the cutter's return. It was a headstrong and fateful decision. Once on shore, Cook and his men marched up to Kalaniʻōpuʻu's house, awakening the king and quickly drawing the attention of thousands of threatening islanders. Cook's trusted crewmen, Gilbert and King, were witness to the escalating tensions.
All this time, the old king remained on the ground, Captain Cook not willing to abandon the object for which he had come on shore, continuing to urge him in the most pressing manner to proceed, while the chiefs who stood round him insisted on his staying where he was.
Cook might then have given up and still escaped unscathed, but fate had turned against the famed adventurer. At that moment, word reached the growing mob that one of Cook's men stationed in the bay had shot and killed a popular island chief.
At this time, someone threatens Cook, and Cook, being frustrated and irritated, takes his pistol and shoots at the person.
The small shot from Cook's gun couldn't penetrate the shield of his assailant. A murmur went through the agitated crowd. The white man's weapons were not always deadly. Now more aggravated than ever, Cook fired again, and this time shot a bystander. The islanders didn't wait for another provocation.
One of the chiefs, more daring than the rest, stepped behind our commander and stabbed him betwixt the shoulders with an iron dagger. Another at that instant gave him a blow with a club on the head, by which he fell into the water.
Bloody and dazed, Cook staggered to his feet for a few moments as a ferocious battle raged around him. Then, in the most debated gesture of his life, he waved at his longboats patrolling nearby in the bay. Was he signaling them to come into shore or to retreat?
He was standing at the water's edge and calling out to the boats to cease firing and to pull in. If it be true, as some of those who were present have imagined, that the Marines and boatmen had fired without his orders, and that he was desirous of preventing any further bloodshed, it is not improbable that his humanity on this occasion proved fatal to him. His body was immediately dragged on shore and surrounded by the enemy, who, snatching the dagger out of each other's hands, shared a savage eagerness to have a share in his destruction.
When the battle ended, the British survivors retreated to their ships while the islanders retrieved the dead. Cook and 4 British Marines and more than 15 Hawaiians lay slain on the shore. A ghostly pall descended over the island, and as the shock of the violence drifted away like gentle waves upon the shore, each side contemplated what the death of Captain Cook had cost them. The British had lost a father. The Hawaiians had lost a god. For 2 quiet, mournful days, the British and Hawaiians eyed each other suspiciously across the expanse of Kealakekua Bay. But on February the 16th, a native canoe slipped through the night's inky darkness towards the British vessels.
About 9 o'clock in the evening, some people were discovered paddling very softly to the ships. To our great astonishment, they proved to be 2 of the natives, who had brought with them about 5 pounds of human flesh, which they told us was Captain Cook.
Though Cook's mutilation was appalling to the Christian-bred British, Captain Clark recognized the gesture as an offering of peace. The downcast British sailors gave their revered captain a traditional burial at sea. On February the 23rd, 1779, with Captain Clark now in charge of the expedition, the Resolution and Discovery bid a final farewell to Kealakekua Bay. The open seas and another attempt at the Northwest Passage lay ahead of them now, but their despair over the loss of their commander would haunt the rest of the journey.
His great qualities are admired beyond anything I can express. I gloried in him, and my heart bleeds to this day whenever I think of his fate.
Tragedy seemed to follow the expedition from that day forward. The attempt to locate the Northwest Passage failed. Captain Clark succumbed to tuberculosis before the ships arrived back in England in October of 1780. Cook's legend grew in the decades following his death. True to his lifelong ambition, this son of a day laborer had helped shape the face of the world of his times.
I think it's impossible to explain how Cook developed the vision of the world that he did, particularly given his lack of formal education as a child. He clearly had an enormous imaginative capacity to respond to different circumstances, and we just have to stand in awe of it, I think.
Cook's mythic journeys took him from the heaven of exotic Polynesia to the hellishly frozen landscape of Antarctica. Repeatedly he tempted the fates of these extremes, and repeatedly he prevailed.
And what we see on the 3rd voyage is Cook doing it again, but this time he doesn't come out of the underworld. It kills him.
The sea, it's said, always rises to reclaim its own. It turns the humblest of men into heroes, the loneliest of men into the idols of thousands. But all things that begin with the sea end with the sea, for legendary adventurers and mere mortals alike.
sailing time between Europe and China.
Not accidentally, Palliser and Sandwich mentioned to the upwardly mobile Cook the £20,000 reward for the man who actually unravelled this last great geographical mystery. It was a princely sum, enough to make Cook a wealthy man indeed. The promise of riches, combined with the appeal to Cook's vanity and continual yearning for adventure, were too much for the retired hero to resist.
The result is that Cook is enticed into it, partly perhaps by the chance of upward mobility into the lower aristocracy with all this reward, partly, I think, a sense of possibility to be the discoverer of the Northwest Passage.
And thus the die was cast. Cook raised his glass and agreed to lead one last voyage. He couldn't have imagined the dangers into which that simple toast would lead him. To find himself in the company of the most important men in England proved just how far the famous explorer had risen from his very humble roots. Yet mastery of the sea had seemed to be an indelible part of James Cook's destiny, despite his unassuming boyhood in a tiny Yorkshire village. The son of a humble day labourer, young Cook displayed an early aptitude in mathematics and in language, though he never did perfect his spelling. By his late teens, the ambitious young man was chafing to see the world that lay beyond the boundaries of the wind-swept Yorkshire moors.
He wanted adventure, and he wanted to get away from the kind of labourer's work that his father had.
At the age of 18, the hardy, 6-foot-tall lad became an apprentice with the Walkers of Whitby shipping firm. Within 5 years, after many a late-night squinting over tedious charts and trigonomic calculations, Cook had taught himself the basics of navigation. His perseverance paid off, and Cook was promoted to mate. He made himself invaluable to his employer, who clearly had plans for his advancement. But young James had other, more ambitious ideas. In 1755, with the looming possibility of the 7 Years' War with France, he joined the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman. It was an enormous risk, for to become a naval officer in those days depended less on seamanship than on patronage connections. But aboard the 6-gun, 400-man Eagle, Seaman Cook would meet a commanding officer who looked for merit rather than breeding in his men, the powerful, well-connected Sir Hugh Palliser. Palliser took Cook under his wing and became his strong supporter.
The British Navy ran totally on patronage, and to have a patron and rising patron was what you wanted. If Palliser was going up, Cook believed if he supported Palliser, he would go up too, and Palliser did become comptroller of the Navy.
In the summer of 1757, just 2 years after joining the Navy, Cook was made master of the Pembroke and sent to North America. His mapping and navigation
had to be balanced by an equivalent landmass in the southern hemisphere, or else the world would be out of kilter.
Alexander Dalrymple, a Scottish gadfly and self-proclaimed adventurer who passionately believed in Terra Australis, campaigned vigorously to the Royal Society to lead the expedition himself. But the Navy wouldn't approve a civilian to command one of its ships. Instead, they chose James Cook, an unknown, common-born navigator. Dalrymple was furious, and from that point on appointed himself Cook's lifelong nemesis. Despite antagonism from Dalrymple, Cook began preparations for his first voyage of discovery. The detail-oriented mariner supervised every step himself in the preparations of his ship, the HMS Endeavour, from the caulking of the hulls to the fitting of her masts and sails. By August of 1768, the Endeavour was bound for Tahiti, thousands of miles away. In addition to the 85 crewmen aboard, several upper-class gentlemen lined the ship's decks. It was common during this era of exploration for wealthy, educated young men to buy their way onto voyages like the Venus expedition. On this trip, young Joseph Banks, an amateur botanist from an influential family, had brought with him an entourage of compatriots, 2 of them artists, whose goal was to document every detail of this historic trip. A self-educated Cook was inspired by the presence of these active young minds, and he and Banks became fast friends. 1776, a night when the London fog lay wet and cold over the stone fortresses of Admiralty Yard. It was to be a fateful night in the life of Captain James Cook, 47 years old and a bona fide household name after his first 2 voyages of discovery. Cook had spent more than 6 years at sea, venturing to many corners of the globe. Now he was retired, with a prestigious and lucrative post at the Greenwich Naval Hospital to pay the bills, and a hero's laurels to rest on indefinitely. But the letters of the great explorer reveal a soul already restless without a ship to command.
Whether I can bring myself to like ease and retirement, time will show. The Resolution will soon be sent out again, but I shall not command her. My fate drives me from one extreme to another.
The Admiralty brass had a devious plan in mind for the famed navigator when they invited him to dinner on that blustery winter night. After plenty of robust wine and rich flattery, Cook's first and most loyal supporter, Sir Hugh Palliser, and his newest patron, the Earl of Sandwich, asked the celebrated captain to advise them about an upcoming naval expedition. The search for the legendary Northwest Passage between Europe and Asia.
From the 16th century, European nations sought for either a northwest or a northeast passage above North America or above Europe and Asia. A northwest passage would have greatly cut the
national brilliance, helped ensure a British victory in the Battle of Quebec. But when the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, the market for naval heroes began to wane. For the first time in his already remarkable young life, the 34-year-old Cook seemed to be facing a dead end in his career. But both heaven and earth, it seemed, were conspiring to move James Cook a step closer to his formidable destiny. For the leaders of Europe, the Age of Enlightenment heralded the birth of a new era of scientific curiosity and exploration. Astronomers had predicted that the planet Venus would pass between the Earth and the Sun in June of 1769. An accurate observation would make possible the first calculation of the distance between the Earth and the Sun, a breakthrough in celestial navigation and in man's understanding of his place in the undiscovered oceans of the universe. In 1768, the British Royal Society decided to send one of Her Majesty's ships to the South Pacific, deemed a key location to observe this remarkable event. But the Royal Society had a second secret purpose for a Venus expedition, the search for a possible new continent to claim for the king, the mythical Terra Australis.
Terra Australis was the name given to the supposed southern continent. It was a product of theoretical geography. It developed out of a sense that the landmass in the northern hemisphere